Round 6, Consejos, from The Dragon King's Daughter, read by me, the author, Nici. Consejos. Around the year 1984, I started reading a lot of true accounts written by men who were part of the Vietnam War. My reading up on the experiences of the American veterans probably had something to do with the internal investigation that was going on inside of me. As to just why I had become a junkie, my life didn't make sense at all. It just didn't figure. So I followed my gut instinct and started reading about the war. How could you do that? I thought as I read. And then the soldier writer would go on to explain, because the line between right and wrong got so hazy, they would say, because the right to care was driven from me. I was made to believe that they, the villagers, or the Viet Cong, deserved to die. It was all right to rape, torture, and kill in the name of our country. But all the while, they were trying to understand the brutality themselves, being a lot like children with blood-stained hands. The war was bad. The betrayal was worse. A country that had no plan. And blamed the veterans for their night terrors and their inability to speak cohesively after witnessing so much murder and treachery. And now a lot of our war survivors are dead or buried inside of psych wards or living under bridges like so many discarded, misfit, and disfigured men. Men who are described in old-fashioned fairy tales as trolls and ogres. But modern times allow them a true-to-life movie set. The betrayal was the hardest thing for me to understand in my family also. Why was everyone pretending that the incest was not happening to me? Asked a voice deep inside my head. All the women in our family grew up with this, their own personalized question mark. Because if it was wrong to be raped by your own granddad, then why wasn't anyone stopping it? And there was nothing in the web of wisdom spun so carefully through time that said incest wasn't treason. We knew it was too, and that's why we were so mystified. We were being prostituted by a family that professed to love us. It wasn't until we were grown that we stared daringly into the reality of the damage done by the Danish ogre who reigned like a king demon over the men and women in our family. Where other children had a man they called Grandpa, we had a man we had to call Hammond. My sisters tell me that my mother was never allowed to call him Daddy. She had to call him Hammond because he did not want to be known as old and fatherly. He had too much womanizing to do to be known as a daddy. Along with all of us never being allowed to call him grandfather, grandpa, or granddaddy, we also had to endure the rape that started at such a young age that childhood became a lesson in learning how to survive under the ogre's regime, rather than a time for innocent fantasy. My mother was the first child to be sexually enslaved, and then came her brother, my Uncle Bill, who, although he may or may not have been incested, was a product of our family and self-destructed early. Uncle Bill hated Hammond in a most passionate way. As a child, I watched Bill die of Hodgkin's disease, a form, I'm told, of cancer. I watched him deteriorate right before my innocent eyes. It terrified me on some deep level, I suppose, to see someone so healthy decompose. It wasn't Bill's death that frightened me so, it was the anger surrounding it. I watched the dark, tall, and handsome man die from a hidden hatred. He hated the sinister behavior of his own father. He turned his hate inward until, like a hagfish nested inside of his mouth, it thrust itself into the innards of my Uncle Bill and ate its way out. The doctors cut a hole in his throat that affected his vocals. It made it difficult for him to voice his opinion or express his own emotions. And so he was silenced by the anger that consumed him. As my grandmother played nursemaid to him, she was able to stand guard over the seething hatred that he harbored toward his father in order to continue to protect her husband. My grandmother lived only for her Hammond, deciding early on in life that she would overlook his sexual nuances and shield him from danger. Hammond brought home the bacon, and that was enough for her. Who cares if men like to look at little girls' bottoms? She would ask me point blank in later years. He paid the rent, didn't he? These were the types of comments I endured from my self-righteous Nana, who became quite defensive after my mother's confrontation with her husband, Hammond. One afternoon, I was dining with my grandmother and my 2 children at a Japanese restaurant when my son looked up from his plate of food and noticed a fighting fish that was imprisoned in a glass bowl. The bowl was shaped like a ball and about the size of my father's fist. The fish was swimming around and around in circles with no place to go, encased as he was on display in that bowl. The fish had no parameters to push, no open sea. My son stared at the fish in silence for a while before tears welled up in his eyes and he cried out, "Mom, look at that poor fish. I feel so sorry for him. He can't even swim in that little bowl." My son's 4th grade shoulders locked up real tight. I marveled as I watched his spine curve and his lip twinge in empathetic pain to the reality of the cruelty and enslavement of that mighty little fish. My grandmother asked, "What's wrong?" as she turned her head slowly around in order to look at whatever was causing my child's distress. The fish orbited frantically, which caused nausea to overcome me. I virtually panicked as I sat and watched my grandmother slowly, painstakingly, and yet so composedly turn her head around. It was as if she were molding her upturned chin into an invisible wrap that would shroud her from anything cruel or naughty or indecent. Despite the poise she displayed as she turned her head toward the captive fishy, her hazy eyes revealed that she was more exploited and silenced in a way than the Muslim-cloaked, slit-eyed female strangers from foreign and therefore threatening desert places. Nana stared straight through the fish confined in the bowl, pretending not to see it, turned her head back around to the table, and asked the children which dish was most delicious. From Colorado to California and back again, that was the pattern that began with my grandmother, who married Hammond when she was 16. She married him in order to escape what I would have to speculate was a shattered family situation. Her childhood stories are not consistent, and it's obvious she misconstrued them. She wanted so much to substantiate her own history that she resorted to a Pollyanna viewpoint. It's okay to look for the golden people, even to look at the world through rose-colored glasses, but not when it means sacrificing children. Each and every time we shrug off children's feelings, we are hardening a purity that is an asset to the whole of humanity. My grandmother never validated anyone but Hammond. He was her only hero. Although I suspect marital discord caused her to pack up my mother more than once in order to move them back to California, she always returned to him with hopes of starting over. 30 some odd years later, I retraced my Nana's journey. Quite coincidentally, I say smugly, and my own baby daughter and I traveled the road to California and back to Colorado. The textbook definition of the yo-yo effect is called perpetuation. It took me a few years to put the pieces together, how my life mirrored Nana's and why. But the minute I put the first two pieces together, it wasn't hard to figure out the rest of the puzzle. Unless great evil is confronted, it is allowed free reign, and momentous power it does gain. Incest is multi-generational if the perpetrator is left unaccountable, because the psychological residuals continue to destroy lives even when the physical act isn't in effect. In my Nana's case, she was possessed by the devil of mercy. Her small good of overlooking, forgiving, and therefore indulging Hammond in his sexual idiosyncrasies did nothing more than feed his savage tendencies. He transformed from a curious child whom no one said no to into a demonic monster who had to be fed. After a couple of journeys to and from California, my grandmother probably gave up on any happy ever after and decided to resign herself to her fate with Hammond. Her choice was greatly monetary, as he was a good provider. So what did it matter that he was an ogre who devoured children? At least the children got to eat, argued Nana, with her own self-conscious. I prefer the word stuff when I discuss what incest survivors do with food, as if they were trying to control something by either filling the hole of their empty soul through their stomach or by going to the other extreme and becoming anorexic. Anorexia being a way to say to the world at large, you have no right to enter. Food is considered the most benign form of self-destruction. Unfortunately, eating disorders are often coupled with drinking and drugs and self-exploitative sexual behavior.